Welcome to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams. Today we're exploring the intersection of clinical psychology, neuroscience, and real world application to help you navigate life's complexities with greater skill and understanding. We're venturing into territory that might surprise you: the profound therapeutic power of putting crayon to paper, of giving form to the formless, of letting your hand speak what your mouth cannot say. If you've ever found yourself doodling during a stressful phone call, if you've ever felt that words were utterly inadequate to express what you were experiencing, if you've ever looked at a child's drawing and sensed they were telling you something important that they couldn't articulate, then you already understand intuitively what we're going to explore today: that the images we create might be the most honest conversation we ever have with ourselves. In the caves of Lascaux, France, our ancestors left their mark: handprints, hunting scenes, abstract symbols whose meanings we can only guess at. These weren't just decorative, they were essential. 30,000 years before the invention of written language, humans were already discovering what we're only now beginning to scientifically understand: that creating visual representations of our experience does something fundamental to how we process that experience. The act of making marks, of translating internal states into external forms, appears to be hardwired into our humanity. But here's where it gets interesting from a psychological perspective: the part of your brain that processes trauma, that holds emotional memory, that generates the feelings you can't quite name, it doesn't speak in words. It speaks in images, in colors, in symbols, in spatial relationships. When something overwhelming happens to us, it often gets encoded in this visual, sensory, pre-verbal part of the brain. We might know something happened. We might even be able to recite the facts, but the emotional truth of the experience remains locked away, inaccessible to our verbal processing centers. This is why talk therapy, for all its benefits, sometimes hits a wall. You can talk around trauma, you can talk about trauma, but actually accessing and processing trauma might require speaking the language it's encoded in, the language of image and symbol. This isn't some new age concept, it's neuroscience. The amygdala, where emotional memories are stored, is evolutionarily older than the parts of the brain that process language. It literally speaks a different language, and that language is visual. The formal recognition of this came through people like Margaret Naumburg, who in the 1940s was working with children labeled as problematic at the New York State Psychiatric Unit. These were kids who couldn't or wouldn't talk about what was troubling them, but when Naumburg gave them art materials, something shifted. The children who couldn't verbalize their distress could draw it. The anger that had no words had colors, reds and blacks slashed across paper. The fear that couldn't be spoken had shapes, tiny figures cowering in corners of vast empty pages. What Naumburg observed wasn't just emotional release, though that was certainly happening. She saw that the act of creating these images seemed to change something in the children's relationship to their distress. Once externalized, once given form, the feelings seemed less overwhelming. The children could look at their anger on the page rather than being consumed by it. They could literally get some distance from their emotions, and with that distance came the possibility of understanding, integration, and healing. But it wasn't until the 1970s that we began to understand just how profoundly creating art affects not just our psychology, but our biology. Carl Simonton, a radiation oncologist, did something that seemed almost heretical at the time. He asked his cancer patients to draw their disease and their treatment. He asked them to create images of their white blood cells attacking cancer cells, to visualize and then illustrate their body's healing process. What Simonton discovered changed everything we thought we knew about the mind-body connection. Patients who drew themselves actively fighting their cancer, white blood cells as armies, immune systems as powerful forces, had different outcomes than those who drew themselves as passive victims. The act of creating these images seemed to mobilize something in their actual immune response. This wasn't just positive thinking, it was a fundamental rewiring of how the body understood its relationship to the disease. Bernie Siegel, another oncologist, took this even further. Instead of starting with medical history questionnaires, he'd hand new patients crayons and blank paper and ask them to draw themselves. What emerged on these papers, Siegel claimed, told him more about a patient's prognosis than any lab test. A woman who drew herself in the bottom corner of the page, tiny and insignificant, was revealing something about her will to live that no blood test could measure. A child who drew himself with no body below the waist might be unconsciously preparing for death, or, as one young patient revealed when he turned the page over to show the other half, might be demonstrating a profound faith in recovery that transcended the current moment. These weren't isolated observations. Patients would draw things they didn't consciously know. One woman drew herself with a black spot on her lung months before any scan could detect the tumor that would eventually appear exactly where she'd drawn it. Another patient drew rainbows emanating from his chest, which seemed like pure optimism until surgery revealed an unusual but benign tissue formation that had protected his heart from damage. How do we explain this? How does the hand know what the conscious mind doesn't? The answer might lie in understanding that our bodies are constantly processing information below the threshold of consciousness. Subtle cellular changes, minute shifts in internal chemistry, patterns of sensation too faint to consciously register. All of this information is being collected and processed by parts of our brain that don't have direct access to language centers, but do have access to the motor functions involved in drawing. When you draw without conscious intention, when you let your hand move across the page without your analytical mind directing every stroke, you're accessing this deeper knowledge. You're allowing parts of yourself that normally remain silent to speak, and what they have to say can be revolutionary. The case of Vietnam veterans reveals another dimension of art therapy's power. These were men who'd experienced things for which there literally were no words: the horror of combat, the moral injuries of war, the complete shattering of everything they'd believed about humanity. How do you talk about that? Many couldn't. They'd return from war and retreat into silence, carrying images that haunted them but couldn't be spoken. But they could be sculpted, they could be painted, they could be externalized in clay and paint and charcoal. And when they were, something profound happened. The act of creation became an act of integration, taking the chaotic, fragmentary, intrusive memories and giving them form allowed these veterans to relate to their trauma differently. Instead of being ambushed by flashbacks, they could look at their experience quite literally from the outside. One veteran sculpted a piece showing hands reaching up from the earth, the hands of the friends he couldn't save. The sculpture was horrifying, but creating it allowed him to honor those losses in a way that words never could. Another painted the same scene over and over: a village, flames, screaming children, until gradually, over months, the paintings began to change. The flames became smaller. Flowers began to appear at the edges, not because the memory changed, but because his relationship to the memory transformed through the act of repeatedly giving it form. This process of externalization through art does something crucial. It takes experiences that feel infinite and gives them boundaries. Trauma often feels endless, boundaryless, like it's everything and everywhere. But a painting has edges, a sculpture has dimensions. Even the most horrifying image, once on paper, can be rolled up, put in a drawer, taken out when you're ready to look at it. You can't do that with memories that live only in your head. The work with eating disorder patients revealed something else entirely about how art therapy operates. These patients, particularly those with anorexia, rarely drew human figures, and when they did, the figures had adolescent characteristics: a refusal to acknowledge adult bodies, adult sexuality, adult responsibility. One patient drew herself as a cactus, prickly, unable to be touched, surviving on almost nothing. The image revealed what years of talking hadn't uncovered: her deep fear of intimacy and her pride in being able to survive without normal human needs. As these patients progressed in treatment, their art changed. Human figures began to appear. Bodies became more realistic. One patient who'd consistently drawn herself as various objects, a tree, a house, a cloud, finally drew a human figure. It was crude, stick figure like, but it was human. She'd finally given herself permission to be a person with a body, with needs, with the right to take up space in the world. Children processing trauma through art reveal perhaps the purest form of this healing mechanism. After September 11th, when New York schools reopened, children were given art materials and invited to draw what they were feeling. What emerged was remarkable, not just for the horror it revealed, planes hitting buildings, people falling, smoke and terror, but for what else appeared. Children drew helpers rushing in. They drew their families hugging. They drew themselves as superheroes who could have prevented it. They drew God's hands catching the falling people. These weren't denials of reality. They were attempts to integrate an incomprehensible event into a worldview that could accommodate both horror and hope. The children who drew these images showed fewer symptoms of PTSD than those who only talked about their experience or those who didn't process it at all. The act of creation had literally changed how the trauma was encoded in their nervous systems. Color selection in art therapy reveals another layer of how our unconscious communicates. Across cultures, certain colors consistently represent certain emotional states. Red might represent passion or anger. Black might indicate grief or, surprisingly, empowerment. Yellow often signals energy or anxiety. These aren't learned associations. They seem to be somehow fundamental to how humans process emotion visually. But context matters enormously. A child who uses only black might be processing grief, or they might simply love the way black crayon feels on paper. An adult who avoids color entirely might be emotionally shut down, or they might be someone who thinks in line and form rather than color. This is why art therapy isn't about rigid interpretation, but about curious exploration. What did you notice as you drew? What surprised you? What feels true about this image, even if you can't explain why? The phenomenon of doodling deserves special attention. Those seemingly mindless marks we make while on the phone, in meetings, during lectures, they're not mindless at all. They're the unconscious mind working through something while the conscious mind is otherwise occupied. Heavy, dark, jagged lines might indicate aggression or frustration. Soft curved lines might suggest contentment or daydreaming. Repetitive patterns might be self-soothing behaviors, ways of creating order when feeling chaotic. I knew an executive who discovered through her doodles that she always drew cages when in meetings with a particular colleague. She hadn't consciously recognized feeling trapped by this person, but her hand knew. Once she saw the pattern, dozens of little cages in the margins of meeting notes spanning months, she couldn't unsee it. It led her to recognize and eventually address a dynamic she'd been unconsciously tolerating, but that was slowly destroying her job satisfaction. The physical act of making art engages multiple brain systems simultaneously in a way that talking simply doesn't. When you draw, you're using motor functions, visual processing, spatial reasoning, and emotional processing all at once. You're creating new neural pathways, literally rewiring your brain's response to whatever you're drawing about. This is why art therapy can sometimes achieve in weeks what talk therapy might take years to accomplish. It's engaging more of the brain in the healing process. The case of drawing unseen illness is particularly fascinating. How does someone draw a tumor they don't know they have? How does a child represent a heart condition that hasn't been diagnosed? One theory is that our bodies are constantly sending signals that don't quite reach conscious awareness, but do influence our intuitive sense of ourselves. When we bypass the analytical mind and let the hand draw freely, these subtle signals can find expression. This might sound mystical, but consider how much processing your brain does below the threshold of consciousness. You're regulating your heartbeat, your breathing, your digestion, the balance of countless chemicals, all without conscious awareness. Is it so impossible that some part of you knows when something in this incredibly complex system is off, even if that knowledge hasn't reached your conscious mind? The therapeutic power of art extends beyond individual healing to collective processing. After natural disasters, after acts of terrorism, after any collective trauma, communities instinctively turn to art. Memorial walls covered with drawings, photographs, and messages, chalk art on sidewalks, painted rocks left in public places. These aren't just memorials, they're collective processing, communities metabolizing trauma together through shared creation. During the Iraq War, something remarkable happened. Soldiers started blogging, but not just in words. They posted drawings, sketches made in the margins of duty logs, images carved into concrete barriers. These images said what operational security prevented them from writing: the fear, the boredom, the surreal beauty of sunrise over the desert, the horror of what they'd witnessed. Military families back home began their own art practices, children drawing their deployed parents, spouses creating visual calendars counting down to homecoming. The question of interpretation in art therapy is crucial and often misunderstood. The therapist or outsider's interpretation is far less important than what the artist sees in their own work. A tree might typically represent life energy, but for the person who drew it, it might represent their grandfather who taught them to climb trees. A house might generally symbolize security, but for someone else, it might represent imprisonment. The meaning lives in the relationship between the creator and the created, not in any universal symbol system. This is why art therapy is ultimately about empowerment. You're not creating images for someone else to analyze and tell you what's wrong with you. You're creating images to discover what you already know, but haven't been able to access. You're giving form to the formless, voice to the voiceless parts of yourself. You're becoming both the author and the reader of your own internal landscape. The resistance many people feel to art therapy, "I can't draw, I'm not artistic," is itself therapeutic to overcome. This resistance often masks a deeper fear, the fear of what might emerge if we let our hands move without our conscious control. What if we discover we're angrier than we thought, more frightened, more grief stricken? But also, what if we discover we're stronger than we knew, more creative, more resilient? The child who draws themselves huge after being told they're insignificant is engaging in a form of resistance through art. The abuse survivor who draws themselves surrounded by protective light is reimagining their relationship to vulnerability. The patient who draws their cancer cells being devoured by Pac Man like immune cells is literally rewriting their body's narrative. These aren't just pictures, they're acts of rebellion against victimhood, declarations of agency in situations that seem to offer none. Art therapy with children facing terminal illness reveals something profound about the human capacity to find meaning even in the face of death. These children often draw journeys, paths leading to light, rockets, ships heading to stars, butterflies emerging from cocoons. They draw themselves not as dying, but as transforming. One 8-year-old with leukemia drew herself as a candle, explaining, "The flame is my spirit, and even when the candle melts away, the light keeps going up and up." These images don't deny death, but they reframe it. They allow children to maintain agency and meaning even as their bodies fail. Parents who keep these drawings often say they provide more comfort than any words of consolation. The images become bridges between the living and the dead, tangible proof that even in their final days, their children were still creating, still making meaning, still leaving their mark on the world. The evolution of images over time tells its own story. A patient beginning therapy might draw themselves as a tiny figure at the bottom of the page. Months later, the figure has moved to the center. Eventually, it fills the page. No one told them to draw themselves larger. The change emerged organically as their sense of self-worth grew. These visual progressions provide concrete evidence of internal change that can be incredibly motivating during the difficult work of healing. Similarly, someone processing grief might begin with images that are entirely black, chaotic, fragmented. Over time, color begins to appear, forms become more coherent. Not because the grief goes away, but because the relationship to grief evolves. The final images might still contain darkness, but it's integrated darkness, part of a larger whole that includes light and color and form. The use of different media in art therapy offers different therapeutic experiences. Pencils offer control and precision, good for people who feel chaotic and need to create order. Finger paints involve the whole body, breaking down barriers between self and creation, useful for people who are overly controlled or disconnected from their bodies. Clay can be pounded, thrown, destroyed, and reformed, perfect for processing anger. Watercolors flow and blend unpredictably, teaching tolerance for uncertainty. The choice of medium itself can be diagnostic. Someone who only uses pencils, making tiny, precise marks, might be revealing a need for control. Someone who immediately goes for the biggest brush and the boldest colors might be comfortable with expression but struggling with boundaries. Watching how someone approaches art materials, hesitantly or eagerly, carefully or carelessly, reveals patterns that likely show up in other areas of their life. The digital age has added new dimensions to art therapy. Digital drawing tools allow for endless revision without the commitment of making marks on paper. For someone paralyzed by perfectionism, this can be liberating, but for someone who needs to experience the physicality of creation, the resistance of paper, the texture of paint, digital tools might feel too removed, too abstract. Virtual reality art therapy is emerging as a particularly powerful tool for trauma processing. Patients can literally step inside their drawings, confront their fears in three-dimensional space, and practice new responses in a completely controlled environment. A veteran with PTSD can recreate and then reshape traumatic scenes. A patient with phobias can gradually approach feared objects they've drawn. The line between creation and experience blurs in ways that amplify the therapeutic effect. But there's something irreplaceable about the physical act of making marks on paper. The way crayon drags across the page, the way paint bleeds into paper, the way clay responds to pressure, these sensory experiences engage parts of our nervous system that screens simply can't reach. The smell of markers, the texture of pastels on your fingers, the sound of pencil on paper, these become part of the therapeutic experience, grounding us in our bodies even as we explore our minds. The community aspect of art therapy groups adds another dimension. Seeing others create, witnessing their courage in putting internal experiences into external form, creates a kind of permission structure. If they can draw their depression, maybe you can draw your anxiety. If they can share their image of trauma, maybe you can share your image of loss. The images become a bridge, not just between internal and external, but between self and other, creating connection where words might maintain distance. The role of the art therapist has evolved significantly since the field's inception. Originally seen as interpreters, reading the symbolic meaning of patients' work like psychological tea leaves, art therapists now see themselves more as facilitators and witnesses. They create safe spaces for creation, ask curious questions that help artists explore their own work, and hold space for whatever emerges. The expertise isn't in knowing what a drawing means, but in knowing how to help someone discover what their drawing means to them. This shift reflects a larger understanding about healing, that the answers we need are usually inside us. We just need help accessing them. The art therapist doesn't heal you, they help you heal yourself through the process of creation and reflection. They might notice patterns you miss, suggest materials that might serve your process, or ask questions that help you go deeper, but ultimately, you are both the creator and the interpreter of your own work. Cultural considerations in art therapy are crucial. Different cultures have different relationships with color, symbol, and the act of creation itself. In some cultures, making representational art is taboo. In others, certain colors have specific religious or social meanings that might override personal associations. A culturally competent art therapist understands these differences and adapts their approach accordingly, never imposing Western artistic traditions or interpretations on non Western expressions. Indigenous approaches to art as healing often predate and surpass Western art therapy in sophistication. Sand paintings, textile work, ceremonial masks. These aren't just art, they're technologies of healing that engage community, spirit, and individual in ways Western therapy is only beginning to understand. The integration of these traditions with contemporary art therapy offers exciting possibilities for more holistic approaches to healing. The question of artistic skill is perhaps the most persistent barrier to art therapy and also the most irrelevant. The therapeutic value of art has nothing to do with its aesthetic quality. A stick figure drawn with shaking hands might contain more therapeutic power than a technically perfect portrait. The art is a means, not an end. It's a language, not a performance. Judging therapeutic art by artistic standards is like judging a cry for help by its grammatical correctness. In fact, sometimes the worse the art, the better the therapy. When we let go of trying to make something beautiful and focus on making something true, we access different parts of ourselves. The perfectionist who finally allows themselves to make something ugly might be breaking through years of rigid self control. The people pleaser who draws something they know others won't like might be claiming their right to authentic expression. Children understand this intuitively. They don't draw to create art, they draw to process experience. They draw mommy with arms long enough to reach them wherever they are. They draw themselves as big as houses when they feel powerful, as small as ants when they feel insignificant. They draw their fears with multiple eyes and teeth, their wishes with wings and rainbows. The accuracy isn't in the representation, but in the emotional truth. Adults have to relearn this childlike approach to creation. We've been taught that if we're not good at something, we shouldn't do it. We've been taught that art is for artists, that creation requires talent. But therapy isn't about talent, it's about expression. It's about giving yourself permission to make marks, to take up space, to externalize what's internal without judgment or evaluation. The therapeutic act begins the moment you pick up the crayon. Before you've made a single mark, you've already declared that your internal experience matters enough to be given form. You've already claimed your right to expression. The image that emerges is important, but the act of creating it might be even more so. You're literally making something from nothing, bringing something into existence that didn't exist before. If you can create on paper, you can create in life. The integration of art therapy with other therapeutic modalities amplifies its effectiveness. Combining art therapy with EMDR helps process trauma that's both visual and visceral. Using art therapy alongside cognitive behavioral therapy provides a visual map of thought patterns that can be literally redrawn. Incorporating art therapy into somatic experiencing allows the body's wisdom to find visual expression. Movement and art can be combined, drawing while dancing, painting with the whole body, creating sculptures through embodied expression. Music and art naturally complement each other, with sounds inspiring images and images suggesting rhythms. Even taste and smell can be incorporated, with certain flavors or scents inspiring specific artistic expressions. The more senses involved, the more comprehensive the healing. The future of art therapy is likely to involve even more integration of technology and traditional techniques. Biofeedback responsive art programs that change based on your heart rate or brain waves. AI that can help identify patterns in artistic expression over time. Virtual galleries where people can share their therapeutic art anonymously and find connection through shared visual experiences. But at its core, art therapy will always be about the fundamental human need to make our inside worlds visible, to give form to feeling, to create meaning from chaos? As we think about incorporating art into our own healing and growth, it's worth remembering that every human culture has used visual expression as a form of processing experience. From cave paintings to cathedrals, from sand mandalas to graffiti, humans have always known that some truths can only be told in images. We're not learning something new, we're remembering something ancient, something essential about what it means to be human. The blank page that confronts us when we begin to draw is both terrifying and full of possibility. It asks nothing of us but offers everything: space to explore, to express, to discover, to release. It doesn't care if we can draw. It doesn't judge our technique. It simply receives whatever we offer, holds whatever we need to express, preserves whatever truth we're ready to tell. As we close today's episode of Strides to Solutions, I want to leave you with an invitation that might feel uncomfortable, but could also be transformative. Tonight, gather some simple materials: paper, and whatever writing implements you have, even if it's just a pen or pencil. Then ask yourself, how do I feel right now? And instead of trying to answer in words, let your hand answer on the page. Don't worry about making art. Focus on making marks that feel true. Notice what emerges without judgment. You might surprise yourself with what your hand knows that your mouth cannot say. If you're ready to explore this and other therapeutic techniques more deeply, my book Rescript Your Reality offers a groundbreaking approach to understanding and recalibrating your inner dialogue, including how visual expression can reshape the narratives that define your experience. Available on Amazon, it provides practical exercises for accessing the wisdom of your unconscious mind through both verbal and nonverbal means. Remember, you don't need to be an artist to use art as therapy. You just need to be willing to let your inside world become visible, even if you're the only one who ever sees it. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, this is Esther Adams reminding you that healing isn't always about finding the right words. Sometimes it's about finding the right colors, shapes, and lines to tell the story that lives beyond language.